Twilight 2000 is a revered cult classic role-playing game of the 1980s in which the player characters take on the roles of NATO soldiers who, after 4 years of World War III, tactical and strategic nuclear exchanges have escalated, and their command and control has faltered and ceased to be relevant. The war is over because no one cares to fight it anymore, but these young men and women are stranded along the front in Poland. Do they try to make their way home or see what's left of it? Do they try and uphold some form of justice? Do they try and take on a role in whatever comes next? The game makes it very crystal clear that World War III is only just ending. Food scarcity is written into the rules. It is a hex-crawling sort of game. Many of the early adventures focus on the party of player characters attempting to make their way to a port, the last ship home to America. A few weeks ago, we learned that Free League Publishing would be bringing us the new edition of Twilight 2000, the same Swedish RPG house which brought us Forbidden Lands and Mutant Year Zero. Now, Free League is going to completely revamp the rules and bring them under the umbrella of their own in-house system, and we won't get our first look at those new rules until October, when the backers of the Kickstarter will get alpha PDFs. Notwithstanding, the announcement of this new edition brought in a new wave of nostalgia and love for the old Twilight 2000 among the ranks of my friends. To them, they're a little bit older than me, the specter of World War III was a doom which lingered over the world in the early 80s. Every organ of popular culture, every band had lyrics contemplating this end of the world scenario. Part of this was because there were destabilizing events in those times. The United States sought out the ability to laser Soviet ICBMs out of the sky using an incredibly expensive research program called Star Wars, which of course came to naught. For me, I was a little bit younger. I listened to the fall of the Berlin Wall with 4 generations of my family huddled around a shortwave radio set. It was one of the first times I was up past midnight as a child. I was 6 years old. For me, the Soviet Union was always crumbling. It was always reaching to try and stay relevant. For me, Twilight 2000, and in particular its alternate history, which imagines a Soviet Union which manages to survive to the year 2000, and not only that, is able to fight an aggressive two-front war in the year 1996, is a little bit of a big pill to swallow.
If there is nothing else, meeting adjourned. No. Pardon me?
We can't adjourn.
So I think it's worth noting that Free League does want to sidestep Twilight 2000 towards something more like an alternate history game taking place in the year 2000, as opposed to a near future game about anticipated fears. And so I think we will get answers to a lot of my concerns, a lot of my things which I can't unsee from my childhood, which make the original Twilight 2000 scenario difficult to buy into without hearing how things went differently. First, I want to talk about why this is useful and important, or why anyone should care. And I want to start with a personal narrative. Over the years, I kept hearing about Twilight 2000 as I started taking place in online discourse about RPGs. There was a lot of nostalgia for this game, and I wanted to understand what people liked so much about it. It seemed like a pretty vanilla World War III scenario. It was not particularly plausible, the part where it takes place in the year 2000, and I really wanted to know what sort of geopolitical events could give rise to a protracted 4-year war between the superpowers. The same war that they somehow tied their hands behind their back and didn't use their strategic nuclear arms for. And I asked people in comments on their posts and so on, like, what happened? How did this war occur? And what are the motivations? Is there still acrimony between the sides afterwards? How do the soldiers feel about the war? And people kind of brushed me off, frankly. I've asked this question a number of times over the years in different places, and every time people say one of the following. You can look at Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising and Team Yankee. Those are books that have a slightly more plausible scenario, if that's an issue for you.
Take a look at these old forum posts from 2008. There's a whole bunch of alternate scenarios that people posted. If you can wade down to page 137 of that thread, there's a really good one, if I recall correctly.
Or my personal favorite.
Just change it yourself, kid. If you don't like it, you're the game master. It's your problem.
So, suffice it to say, I found these answers kind of dismissive. And so I kept at it and I kept grilling my closer friends about why it is that this is a non-issue for them. And we did arrive at that answer that they had experienced World War III as this myth that was legitimized and just kind of innately believed during their younger years. Every organ of popular culture, every news headline really anticipated it.
Hardly anyone foresaw the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Then I also dug a little deeper based on their recollections, and I saw that the early 1980s were a really hot time for a number of reasons. And Twilight 2000 didn't really need to go into a lot of details to be successful with the audience of 1984, because all of this stuff was right on the tip of people's memories. It was very recent and fresh. And those years of building tension in the early 80s are a huge contrast from my experience from childhood of things like Chernobyl, of things like the Reykjavik summit, things like Glasnost and Perestroika and marketization, things like the Berlin Wall coming down. That's the body of evidence for me only a couple years of later, which is prejudicing me in the other direction. Now, I am 37 years old. And so every moment since I've been aware and able to comprehend the news has been a story of the inevitability of communism and the Warsaw Pact's downfall. And so this is a huge divide with the older generation of gamers. Is Twilight 2000 going to be a game for more than that older generation? If so, I think it has to step very confidently and with purpose into becoming an alternate history game that has answers to these questions. So why can't I just suspend my disbelief? Why can't I let it go like I would if this were fantasy or sci-fi? Well, I can. It takes extra effort. Notwithstanding that I'm the kind of guy that when I look at fantasy maps with rivers running in circles and so on, I often need to reach for the eye bleach. I can suspend my disbelief. That extra effort comes at an opportunity cost. There's effort that could be invested in creating my character's backstory, understanding my character's motivations, understanding how I relate to the fellow soldiers that will become my adventuring companions. And motivation is incredibly important in a hex-crawling type scenario sort of world. And likewise, the only thing holding hex-crawling, player-motivated sort of exploration gaming from being kind of gonzo random stuff pasted onto the map is a sense of cause and effect, a sense that there's a world being built. It's a garden, seeds are growing, and there's a logic to why things landed where they are, even if they are a jumbled mess, because this is the aftermath of a nuclear war. So from the player's perspective, I can't draw on my knowledge of history. I can't figure out which places to set aside my knowledge or be informed by it to build up a backstory and to use that for motivation. From a game master's perspective, I likewise can't use the vast amount of information we have about what the world was like in the year 2000 and how we can draw upon that, including declassified military stuff, to have a rich resource. We have to kind of discard that or hold it at arm's length because we don't know why history allowed the Soviet Union to continue that long.
There are tons of causes that one can point to, many, many reasons. Not only why it happened, but why it had to happen.
So there's a lot of opportunity costs and there's a lot of reasons why plausible scenarios, or at least scenarios that spell out why things went differently, as opposed to leaving it to the reader to figure out, have a lot to be said for them.
There are many turning points along the way when decisions were made or not made that could have changed the path that the Soviet project was taken.
And why I'm hoping, first, to see some of that from Free League. Second, I'm hoping that the community around Twilight 2000 will become a little bit more accepting of that alternate history world building around events. And thirdly, I may find myself taking part in that, and you may see some of my writing on the Free League workshop once the game goes live, if you're interested in that sort of thing, because I do happen to have some college degrees and a lifetime of studying military history and the like. So I think that my concern over suspension of disbelief is a pragmatic concern. And as time wears on and younger gamers will become older gamers, it also is a utilitarian concern. The majority or the plurality of players will eventually be people who need to set aside and understand where history diverged. So to round this video out, I'm going to give you a little tide over until we get an official version of a Y2K from another world from Free League. I'm going to give over 3 points where my suspension of disbelief is strained in the original Twilight 2000 timeline. And I'm going to give you a little bullet point set of historical changes, which I think can allow the Warsaw Pact to survive until the year 2000. And the other kind of points of unbelievability will be made a little bit more believable if you introduce these elements into your Twilight 2000 imaginings. Of course, this could all be obsolete once we see what Free League's got for us, which I hope will be good. So before we start pulling apart our alternate history and stitching it back together in what I think might be a more plausible fashion, let's fill you in on the basic premises of the 1984 first edition of Twilight 2000's alternate history timeline. We're going to completely ignore the 1992-93 2.2 edition of the game and its own revised timeline, because it's just, the first edition of the game had the plausible scenario. It captured the imagination of the original audience. It's the one that I'm in conversation with. So what happens? Well, first of all, the Soviet Union and the entire Warsaw Pact survive and hold on until the year 1996.
The Soviet Union? I thought you guys broke up.
Yes, that's what we wanted you to think.
Red China is not doing quite as well. There's been a lot of fracturing in the administration, and it's reported that different generals are almost holding fiefdoms as warlords within different parts of China. And it could be perhaps one of these generals, feeling ambitious, brings about a border incident. It's during talks with the Soviet Union over their shared border, which has been in dispute for quite a long time. And this border incident is taken as casus belli. The Soviet Union drives deeply into China and tries to occupy it. It's a strong, offensive, conventional war. There's back and forth between the two sides, and the Soviet armies are running out of manpower. They call upon their Warsaw Pact allies. And in East Germany, some of them balk. Conspiring with their counterparts in West Germany, the West German army, the Bundeswehr, comes across the border to protect the East German units balking at the call to take part in this war in China. And it is at this point that war between NATO and Russia starts to take shape. America rushes in, and the impulsive, mutinous, possibly units within the West German army are backed up by the entire strong arm of American military might. Over the course of 4 years, there's some tactical nuclear strikes. Just some. And there are just some strategic strikes. which include counter-value strikes against cities. All the cities in the United Kingdom lay in ruins by the end of the 1984 timeline. This video is not about that, though. It's about the places where we can make this scenario more plausible. So let's talk about what's implausible in it. Implausibility numero uno. The Soviet Union's economy is feeling up to an aggressive territorial war into Red China, and they also take it as a given that they're going to go ahead and do a second front in the West instead of letting the East Germans go their own way. This is in contravention to what we know about IRL, how there were important reinvestments into infrastructure that weren't being made in the Soviet economy, even in the early 80s. It's the paint over rust phenomenon. It's the sort of things that led to the Chernobyl disaster. Likewise, balance of trade issues had become so acute in Poland and East Germany that even as early as 1979, when the Polish government had to withdraw food subsidies for its workers, there were massive general strikes, and the entire country of Poland was gripped by martial law. Likewise, in East Germany, the writing was on the wall. There were papers circulating at the high echelons of government about how they would be bankrupt if they didn't change their balance of trade situation to pay their foreign debts very soon. This issue creates an inevitability where even if this decline had been arrested, that same money that it would take to get back into getting the oil infrastructure in the USSR running at top-notch quality, that same reinvestment that would keep nuclear reactors from having very bad accidents, that money would not be going into military technology, because in Twilight 2000's timeline, the USSR's technological edge is acute enough that that's how they're able to be really winning the war in China, at least for the first part of it. In fact, in Twilight 2000's timeline, the Soviets are able to Star Wars laser a Chinese strategic nuclear strike out of the sky. So whatever tweaks we make will have to include the USSR finding a giant pile of money, wealth, in order to both keep up militarily while also arresting this problem of balance of trade and infrastructure. The second implausibility, a reticence on all sides to use their nuclear arms, particularly when they're losing a battle. Why isn't it that China, when it is really losing its war with the Soviet Union, they don't draw a red line? They don't say, advance no further, or I will do it. I will vaporize a Soviet tank column and thousands of men with it if you keep attacking us. Why doesn't that happen? The game doesn't seem to have a really good answer for that. We know now, in the year 2020, that the NATO war plans included those kinds of red lines, where if a Soviet conventional advance moving into Western Europe got past a certain river, then NATO howitzers would be loaded with tactical nuclear weapons to blunt the Soviet advance. That's the sort of trade-off that was willing to be made. It's an existential threat. That's what the game is saying China is under. They're going to cease to be China, or they'll be dismembered, and parts of it will be annexed to become new Soviet socialist republics. Whatever changes we make to our timeline need to have some answer for this. Third implausibility, how does the war drag out for 4 years? The temptation to use strategic nuclear arms, or the threat of them, the temptation to hobble the opponent's ability to preempt by preempting oneself, it seems like it would become too great, or perhaps too frightening, to the point where you might use it as a saber to rattle to bring your opponent to the peace table. It seems like escalation or de-escalation would naturally happen in some time before the war went on for that length of time. It seems like the game is married to the idea of a 4-year war so that we can see the troops really entrench, bond with each other. We can see millions of Americans kidnapped or drafted off the street to fight in Central Europe. And to my eyes, in the year 2020, it feels like it wants that more than it wants to be plausible. At least I need a reason why the war goes on that long. So here it is, my tweaked timeline that can answer a lot of these questions, which may be lingering for you, which may help you in your own Twilight 2000 world building or other, alternate history, recent past type imaginings. It all begins in the year 1983 when the Soviet Union achieves nuclear fusion. They keep it a closely guarded secret, and they immediately pay it into massive power generation. The Soviet oil surplus buoys the Russian economy and injects massive foreign exchange monies. Of course, the Middle East is also very destabilized by a newly depressed oil price. Gorbachev comes to power as before in 1985, but he's holding a trump card, and so there's significantly less rapprochement. The communist paradise is on the horizon, and meanwhile, there's huge cracks in the economy and massive inflation, like the Spanish gold rushing in the 1500s and 1600s, which was looted from the Americas. So perestroika and glasnost are slapped on like a band-aid to try and make it to this paradise that's coming. Around 1989, as tensions mount in the Warsaw Pact for more freedom, ethnic separatism is beginning to flare within the USSR. Fusion is revealed to the world dramatically, and the countries within the communist sphere will benefit from it first. It's hanging over the head of places like Poland and East Germany. Soviet-loyal communist parties then win coalition majorities in Eastern European parliaments. They rule tenuously because of this promise. This fourth one is something out of the 2.2 edition of Twilight 2000 that we didn't talk about. And that's that there is a serious amphetamine abuse epidemic in America. It takes a lot of life and energy and joie de vivre out of the USA. And the 1992 election brings a Democrat that acknowledges that American military spending is out of proportion with this coming energy abundant future where, fingers crossed, war will become irrelevant. So there's a peace dividend that is reaped similarly to how it was in our own 1992 through 96 years. Meanwhile, the Chinese economy is not doing well. Russia holds China's feet to the fire. They keep them out of the energy abundant circle. They're not sharing any of that electricity, not any of the fusion tech. They can even afford to oil embargo China. Russian consumer goods are flooding into the West where Chinese goods were IRL for that reason. And it's in this climate that Gorbachev is disappeared sometime around 1993. There are circles within the Soviet Union which see this renewed strength, and they don't see the point of continuing this liberal program. Why not be strong instead of letting all these people talk and run their mouth off? And thus, a bullish junta takes power in the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, China is engaging in provocation. They're trying to get some concessions about this awesome fusion technology from the Russians, and they're doing it by causing some problems along their border with Russia. The same border incident happens, war ignites with the Soviet Union, but the new regime in Russia decides to take advantage. They drive deeply into China for a reason, to seize the rare earth mines and other mineral resources in central China, because the future will involve a great deal of electronics. Resource scarcity will still be a thing. China's losing this war poorly, But I imagine that they do set a red line, a river that the Russians may not advance past. A Soviet general breaches that line, or he didn't get the memo, and a front-wide tactical nuclear salvo ensues, with a further ultimatum for strategic strikes. The Russians respond very quickly to destroy the Chinese strategic nuclear arms. They engage in a preemptive strike. China's strategic ICBMs, their submarines, their bombers are destroyed in their silos, runways, and dockyards. The few remaining Chinese strategic strikes are shot out of the sky by Russian missile defense. Just like in the original, next, Russia's armies are decimated, and they do call their Warsaw Pact armies to the front. There's a similar outbreak of war as the West decides to bring East Germany under its umbrella rather than see East Germans reinforce the Chinese front. We could spice this up a little bit more by saying that there is a fusion reactor in East Germany, which is powering a resurgent East German economy, which is manufacturing a lot of semiconductors and circuitry, which was a place where the Warsaw Pact was deeply behind IRL. And I imagine that in this war, tactical nukes come very early. First to destroy that fusion reactor in East Germany, and then to prevent NATO from advancing its IRBMs too close to the Russian border, and repeatedly kind of preventing the transport infrastructure to allow American missiles to get too close to first strike capability in Russia. So a ceasefire and a truce ensues at some point here because nobody sees the point of continuing in this fashion. And millions of troops entrench across all of Central and Eastern Europe. They bed down as peace negotiations are in fits and starts. It's not like it's a 4-year war. It's a 4-year quiet on the Eastern Front. And somehow, at some point, the strategic Armageddon button is tragically pushed. The cities in America are decimated. The UK is reduced to rubble. And the soldiers at the front walk away from their posts and decide for themselves what they want to do next in the twilight of the year 2000.